Hey everyone, as people roll in, I want you to do me a favor. Give me signs of life in the chat. Also, make sure you have the Q&A section pulled up. So I'm going to wait for any sign of life in the chat before I proceed. Cool. Martin, we got you, man. You winner. Sweet. Richard, Kristen, Matthew, Timothy, Chuck, Martin. Cool. So today we're going to start going over things. This is more of the stuff that's in my original wheelhouse, AI research, more of the technical side of stuff. But I'm going to go over this research paper I recently did and break down how we came to the conclusion of which AI provider is best right now for sales. And I have some caveats in here that I'll mention in the summary. I'm also going to give you guys access to this paper too. In case you don't have it, let me throw it in the resources section. So just some housekeeping stuff too on what we have available for you. We have the Q&A. That's where you'll put questions that you want to get answered. You can put them in the chat, but I might not see them. The Q&A is where I'm going to have my attention. The resources, let me pull up that and see what we have in there already. We have the research doc in there already, so you'll find that in the resources. Make sure you grab that so you can read through on your own. And then we have a webinar coming up on voice AI, how to integrate CloseBot with voice stuff. We've been speaking to people that, oh, my wife's FaceTiming me. I better not answer that. Um, how to use CloseBot with voice the best way possible. So we have more on that coming, I believe, next week. We have Haktan saying, I'm being kicked out constantly. Is it just me? Anyone else encountering that? Let me know. No, no, no. Okay, maybe it is just you. Maybe try a different device, Haktan. Okay. So if you guys are unfamiliar, what we're covering here is the best AI for sales. We have been gathering user information based on user feedback, but also looking at error rates of different AI providers and some other data that let us come to a pretty firm conclusion on which AI is going to be the best for sales. So I think that's why everyone's here. That's what everyone wants to know. So let's just get to it. I'm going to share my screen. We're going to go through this paper. Again, you guys have access to this in the resources. So remember that. Okay. In the intro, I talk about how like a lot has changed in the past few years. And I released this article, but keep in mind that this is really a snapshot in time. And I'm probably going to do a new one of these every quarter just to look at what are user feedback saying? What are the error rates saying? What are the success rates on booking saying? And let you guys know which one is the best. It may be the same one every quarter. I don't know. It may change. We may start to see that these AI providers start to build more for specific use cases, whether it be coding specific or general empathy specific. Like they have to find their niche sometime. We just don't know what's going to happen. So let's look at how we did this. We have been collecting within the CloseBot app. You can go on a message, hover, and click thumbs down on any message. We collect that thumbs down, and then we also allow you to give a reason for the thumbs down, whether it's shared inaccurate information, messed up a booking, other, or just didn't like the way that it responded. And we go specifically into each one of those categories to see um, which one is worse at certain areas between OpenAI 5.2, 4.1, Anthropic, Grok, and Gemini. We already have some questions coming in, so let me pause here. Um, Jay, yeah, for any support related questions, guys, go to chat support. This is not the type of like general office hours for support. We have our 24/7 live chat support. Go there. OpenAI, says Martin, feels super inaccurate for true false AI custom scenario and goal accomplished evaluations. Am I the only one? And then Ron says, is this just for sales or appointment booking, or are they the same? We are lumping everything into sales. That includes booking appointments, general sales, empathy. This is going to encompass everything. Okay, so we have this feedback in the app. And if you haven't seen that, please use it. Obviously, now you see that we look at that and it helps us not only tweak our prompts, but do research and let our users know what the best to use is. And some of you guys are raising your hands. If you have a question, Q&A is the best. If you're having an issue of some sort, um, put it put it in the chat so we know about it. But questions, definitely Q&A. Now, for some of my more nerdy friends out there, you might know that CloseBot does a lot of stuff on the back end, all simultaneously before we even go to respond. We look at a message coming in, we look at where it's at in the conversation flow, we look at what has happened, what's upcoming, we look at what information needs parsed out, field updates. And a lot of the times we use different models to do all of that stuff. Even if you have, let's say, GPT 5.2 picked in your persona, we might be using Anthropic or Grok or Gemini to do various different things before we're actually generating a response. And it's worth mentioning that here we're looking only at the final response. And when you give a thumbs down on a message, we only track that thumbs down, attributing to that final reply. So here, maybe we use 4.1 mini, 4.1, Claude Sonnet for different stages in the pre-processing stage. We're just tracking that thumbs down on that final reply, which in this case was generated by 5.2. The different categories that we're collecting information on are inaccurate booking and date time selected. I don't like the way it sounds, shared inaccurate information, and other. Inaccurate booking, pretty self-explanatory. The I don't like the way it sounds. What this generally points to is the AI not being as empathetic as the person wants, sounding too robotic, that type of stuff. Shared inaccurate information is when a user has uploaded stuff or put things in prompting that they don't believe the AI is following. And then other, I'll show you kind of a word cloud of what we've seen people put in that other category. Jeff said, can you post the link for this document in the chat? Sure. It is also in the resources, but that may not show up well on mobile. I'm not sure. So here's this in the chat as well. And go ahead and share this, guys. If you are engaging with people and they say that something is better for sales than another thing, and it's not what we came to here, ask what their resources are. Ask if they've done the research. A lot of people are financially incentivized to share things that are lies, and that's something we will not do. So share this with them. Spread the word. Spread the truth. The data we looked at was from January 2nd to February 2nd. The reason I didn't want to look back further is because, as you guys know, we have tons of stuff changing in CloseBot, but these models are also changing all the time. So it doesn't provide us much help to look back over the past year and lump in all of these things that are no longer true. So we just looked at the past month of data. Here's how much data we got for each of the categories. The highest one being other, the next being inaccurate information, don't like the way it sounds, and inaccurate booking by far the least. Because this one had so few, we don't actually use the results for inaccurate booking in our determination of which AI is the best. But I'll show you the data anyway. Across all these, we got about 300 pieces of data across, I think it was almost 40 different accounts. So if you guys aren't providing feedback, again, please do that. The more feedback we get, the more accurate information we can give you. So let's look into don't like the overall sound. We see that Gemini was the highest culprit in don't like the overall sound, and then Grok. This was surprising to me because I was using Gemini mainly because I didn't really like OpenAI 5.2, so I figured why not switch to Gemini, and I thought Gemini was better than 5.2. Turns out, though, it's not the best on sound. At least that's what our users are saying. If you guys have found anything different, put it in the chat. Let us know if you guys are using Gemini. I want to know who's using Gemini right now. During this time, let's see, the way I compared this is percentage based. So I'm not looking at the total number of thumbs downs here. I'm looking at the total number of thumbs downs as a percentage of the total number of times that model was used. So we're looking for the highest error rate, the highest percentage of thumbs downs compared to overall usage of that model. So it's much more characteristic of generally how it's going to behave. Gemini, we have a couple people using Gemini. I want to know too, who is in here not using CloseBot? Because this applies to you guys as well. A lot of providers will allow you to pick the model, whether it be, I think almost all of them should allow OpenAI. And then it's going to be probably Gemini and Anthropic that they allow. But this is useful for you guys too. So if you're in here and you're not a CloseBot user, first of all, you should be. We are pioneering research. We have been months, if not years ahead on innovation in all of the categories. And you want to be with an industry leader when it comes down to it, especially in something like AI, where to be 2.5 years behind on a feature release is like death. You don't want to be in that boat. You want to be using CloseBot. But that aside, this is going to be useful for you. Shared inaccurate information. So in here, Gemini did a little bit better, still not the best. See, Gemini here percentage-wise. And we had Grok was the highest culprit of sharing inaccurate information. So interesting that Grok so far and Gemini have been the top negative ones on don't like overall sound and shared inaccurate information. But then they flipped. In this, again, important to note that there are some things outside of this provider's control, like our ability to pull in context. If you remember, we have this pre-processing stuff we do. One of those things is pulling in documents that we think could be helpful for the AI. And like we don't use Grok for that. We don't use Grok to pull in the information, but we do load that information into Grok for it to give the final reply. Since it's such a big percentage of Grok mishaps, we are seeing that there's probably something there. So that it's probably more than just our logic in these cases. This is a strong enough depiction that Grok probably has a hard time referencing context that it's given and giving the right information. So someone asked, what is the nature of inaccurate information? That would be if you loaded in a Word document of all of a certain company's service offerings and what the prices are and a description of those, and then someone asked about it, Grok would have the highest likelihood of getting the answers wrong. saying the wrong thing. Okay. On the inaccurate booking side, like I said, we just didn't have enough information, not enough feedback. I think there were only 7 points of feedback where people said inaccurate bookings happened. So, first of all, again, use this. Um, use the thumbs down to let us know so we can actually use this in our research. Second of all, CloseBot's one of the best ones out there, if not the best in accuracy in booking. So I would expect this to be the lowest count in accurate bookings. You can read into this if you want. I won't even review it because there were only 7 pieces of data. It's just not worth going into. The other category, though, is, and I pulled in all of the when someone gives a thumbs down and they put other, they can type in their reason. And so I did a word cloud of all of those reasons to try to see what the biggest things were that were coming up in the other category. And it came down to repetition, too pushy, and then for some reason people were talking about inaccurate booking, but in the other category. So that did happen too. But the biggest ones, repetition and too pushy. And in here, people named Grok and again, Gemini as the biggest culprits. So we see a recurring theme here with Grok and Gemini, at least based on user feedback. And I would say user feedback is the most important feedback in this report. Something else we looked at was error rate analysis. So anytime we have a message and we send it to Gemini, Anthropic, Grok, OpenAI to get a response, it's their job to respond with what we should send as a message. But sometimes they return an error that's not our fault, or they'll return an empty response, like just an empty message. And like, what do we do with that? Sometimes it times out. So we send a message asking for a reply and it sits there and loads forever and never gives us something back. These are all things that happen with any software product. And it doesn't necessarily impact the final response because we do have a retry mechanism that retries that same provider if they do fail, and then will, of course, fall back to your other providers. So it's not going to affect your experience in CloseBot, but it does point to something shaky in their overall architecture. So we did weight this a little bit, even though it doesn't affect the final reply. The fact that some systems are a little more shaky than others um, is worth noting in our decision to come to which is the best overall sales AI. Let's look. Okay, so here we had Gemini is the one with the shakiest architecture, and then OpenAI, and then Anthropic was most stable. George had a question. Shouldn't the feedback, research, and analysis be at a LLM level rather than an AI provider level? The more advanced and recent models seem to be more accurate. George, that's a good question. When we decide the AI that's going to be doing the final reply, first of all, CloseBot picks the final model. You can pick the AI provider, whether it be OpenAI, Anthropic, Gemini, Grok. We pick the final model for you because a lot of people, even though they think they know what's best, they don't. For example, a lot of the more recent models are better at coding. They're they prioritize the coding benchmarks, tool use benchmarks, but they fail drastically on empathy. So we do a lot of testing on our end within each AI provider to determine which one is going to be the best at sales. And then this is pitting all of those against each other. Hope that makes sense. So again, error rate frequency, definitely not as important as human feedback, but something worth considering. And then an overall vibe check. So when you do research papers like this that count on human feedback, there are some things to keep in mind. The people that are most likely to give feedback are also the most likely to be in here tinkering and picking something that's not the default. The default has been OpenAI, both 4.1 and 5.2 lately. So we would expect more negative feedback for Gemini, Grok, and Anthropic because it's the tinkerers that are picking the non-defaults. And more than likely, it's those tinkerers also giving thumbs down. It's the people that have the default set that are never logging in and they just let it run and do its thing. So they would be giving less thumbs down to the defaults. So that's something worth keeping in mind. And because that, we also wanted to do just a general vibe check, test ourselves. And we've done that. We've tested with all the models, but we've also done polls in a couple locations, including our Facebook group. Here is what we've gotten from our polls. OpenAI 4.1 being the preferred provider, a little over half, and Anthropic over here, with the smallest being OpenAI 5.2, Gemini, and Grok. It's now worth mentioning on OpenAI 4.1 and 5.2. Like I said, when you guys select an AI provider, we pick the model from that provider that we're going to use. We were using OpenAI 4.1, and then through our users' pleas, over a month's time, we were doing testing and decided to update to it to be 5.2. And a lot of people found that they didn't like the replies of 5.2. Now we give you the ability to choose either one within the app. But that's something worth noting and something worth keeping in mind when I say things like, some of these older models, they're more empathetic. Some of the newer models are optimized for different things. And that's up to our team to determine. You guys as agencies shouldn't be the ones in there tinkering, and you don't have enough data to go in and figure out which model is best for what. We have OpenAI 5.2 is trash from Martin. And this is true. In sales, I do think it is pretty trash. But for code, it's fantastic. So it depends. Worth mentioning about Anthropic. Anthropic was the second AI provider that CloseBot integrated with, and we made it our default back in 2023. So it's always been a personal favorite of mine ever since they started the company. But keeping my bias out of here and looking purely at the data. Gemini is one of the newer ones, and it's gotten a lot of attention lately, which is why it was one of the more recent ones we tried on our homepage of our website. And then Grok is the least utilized one in CloseBot right now, and it might be because they just don't have a serious type feel about them. It's used a lot for jokes and humor, and people don't think about it as like a sales tool. And the data tends to agree with that. Here's how we picked our winner. So we had our winner based on human feedback, our winner based on error rates, and our winner based on the vibe checks. So we did 3 different categories of winners. On human feedback, first of all, we didn't use the booking feedback. Then we gave each one a score, with 1 being the best and 5 being the worst in each category. And then we summed those scores, and we found that Anthropic was the best in this, with OpenAI 4.1 being the next best, and then OpenAI 5.2, followed by Gemini, and then Grok, pretty far behind Gemini and Grok. Let me go and answer some questions real quick. We're still able to pick OpenAI 4.1 since I just got notified they shut down personal ChatGPT on February 13th. Yes, that is ChatGPT, which is its own tool. We still have access to these models via the API. Then we had another question. Does CloseBot have any internal performance reports or testing results that show which AI model performed best independent of user feedback? We look at user feedback as the most important thing, and then error rates, and then vibe check. Other than that, it's impossible to tell. Some people are, some people, for example, require that leads be massively pre-qualified before booking an appointment. Others don't use appointment bookings at all. They're qualifying leads and then having that trigger, adding a tag to a contact for a human to call them. So there's just so much variability going on that we can't look at the data on node completion and tie that to success. Let's go into the next category. Winner based on vibe check. So it's important, again, to keep in mind the louder users are more likely to have their opinions heard. Most of our users doing most of our volume are not on Facebook. They're not voting in polls. They don't go tinker. We release new models. They don't care. When we released Gemini, for example, they didn't go in there and test it. They're more likely to just stick with the default. It's more so the people that are tinkering that are going to be voting in the polls. So we would expect the defaults to do worse than they typically would. Other people have outdated opinions. Things are changing so often, not only with the AI providers, but with how we utilize them in CloseBot. So opinions you may have had a month ago may not be valid today as things change. And then prompting is the largest influence on small scale testing. We came to the conclusion, for example, that Anthropic was the winner across the board. But that doesn't mean you should go and switch all of your stuff over to Anthropic. When you are setting up your persona and you're picking the voice tone and you are putting in the information on how you want it to respond, clarifying instructions on how to respond, you are shaping that model. That same prompting may perform horribly with OpenAI. So that's important to keep in mind. You can't just flip these. If you want to, you can try, see how it performs. It might perform better, but I'm just giving you a warning that it might not. And that doesn't mean it's at fault of the model or the AI provider. It's your prompting that's probably optimized for a different provider you were using before. So then why does any of this matter? Some of you might be asking. What this really shows is which AI is going to be the most forgiving. Everyone has a different way of prompting, different voice styles they like to use. And what we're seeing here is it's going to be more forgiving to use Anthropic for those. That's more traditionally going to get you better results across the board. Okay, we have some other questions. Should we be reorganizing CloseBot persona provider priority arrangement based on this data? Will, what I would suggest is making a new persona with the defaults that we have put in there for you, and then using that persona for a little bit and just seeing how you like that with Anthropic toward the top if you're not using Anthropic. See how you like that. And then if you like that, switch over to that one, getting rid of everything you had in your other one, and then start to hone in that persona. What model is being used for Anthropic? Just wondering. It's Sonnet 4, I believe. Yep, and we had that question again. What version of Anthropic? And let me just pull it open and look. Because after running this report, obviously, went through and optimized things for Anthropic instead. So let me see what we're running, and then I'll drop it in the chat. Something else worth mentioning, that final reply does also do things like use the tools. Remember, we have the tools of Smart FAQ and email use. A couple examples. If you are not using CloseBot and you're not used to what a tool is, the Smart FAQ allows your AI to log a question it didn't know the answer to. And I'll share my screen. I don't have anything to hide in our CloseBot account. So let me show you. Okay, so we have our tools over here. Smart FAQ and email are two that the AI decides when it wants to use those. Smart FAQ allows your AI to log a question it doesn't know the answer to. And then you can fill in the answer to the question and decide whether or not you want it to follow up with the answer. It logs it in what we call our Smart FAQ area, which is in our uploads, but it also notifies you here anytime you get a new Smart FAQ item. When I switched to Anthropic, I noticed that it was logging many more Smart FAQs than it did before. And that told me it was not as comfortable with coming up with information on its own if it wasn't explicitly in its context, which is probably also why it was one of the lowest culprits on shared inaccurate information. Like we got a question recently, what are current support response times? That's not something that we have on our website. We don't have it as an upload. We don't have it in our help docs, so it wouldn't know how to answer that. I could give it the answer here. So it depends on whether you are with level 1 or 2 support, but we aim for less than 5 minutes with our level 1 human support team available 24/7. And then I'll put in here if you think you're stuck in no man's land, you can reach them at support at closebot.ai. So if I save this, it'll know the answer next time. But the cool thing is, it'll also open up this screen where I can see the conversation and I can choose to send a follow-up, which will actually reach back out to that person on the best channel available to let them know the answer to that question that they had that it didn't know the answer to. So if that came in off live chat and we had conversationally gotten their phone number and or email, it would automatically switch and text them an answer to that question or email them an answer to that question. As long as you have that enabled, you're enabling the AI to reach out on those channels. So the point of that being, Anthropic is using that tool more than I noticed in OpenAI and Gemini. So that's something that we might research in the future. But we have some bigger changes coming to CloseBot that are going to affect how these tools run too. I can't necessarily go into that here, but we have big things in the works with tool use and MCPs with CloseBot. Right now, Haktan, the homepage is using Anthropic. Anthony, the little hints on the secrets are tools. That's what I'll give you, tools. Number one, so David, number one, I would say is Anthropic. Number two would be OpenAI 4.1. And number three would be OpenAI 5.2. Yes. Before we finish up with final questions, I want you guys to go take a look at our roadmap and changelog. We come out with so much stuff, guys, so much stuff. And if you're not a CloseBot user and you want to keep up to date on what we're doing, make a free account. It doesn't cost you any money. We don't collect your card information to make an account. And then come over here and check out our latest updates for a while. Just be a fly on the wall and watch. It is astonishing how fast we are able to move. We have, that being said, a big update coming to our chats area. This is getting a full redo. And this launches towards the end of this week. That will bring live updating of this conversation screen. It'll bring the ability to examine and see the flow path a contact has used, has taken to get through the conversation. You'll be able to have saved views. Like if you want a saved view that only shows conversations from sources that are like one of these three sources that are engaging with this job flow. You know, you'll have your preset filters in there. You can click to fast travel to that view. Our search is going to get better and faster. The ability to send messages from within CloseBot. So if you don't want to click see contact and then the link that'll show up here to fast travel to that contact in High Level or HubSpot, you'll be able to send messages from within CloseBot. Just a lot of really good stuff happening. We have a couple other questions. So now here's where I'll just go into a general Q&A for the next 5 minutes. Will HIPAA compliance only be available to agencies? If you guys go to closebot.com and you click on pricing, on our enterprise plan, that's where we look at HIPAA coverage. So if you want more information on that, click to talk to sales. That also brings a service level agreement for uptime, prioritized support, and an option for one-on-one video support, dedicated account rep. We'll do quarterly audits of your system, exclusive office hours, and even a custom marketplace app if you want. So instead of it showing CloseBot when you integrate for a sub account, you can have it be your brand, your whatever. It won't even be gray labeled at like lead connector. It'll be your brand. Okay. Let me go back over to our open questions. We have quite a few of them. We do many discovery calls that are meant to only book a discovery call, not an actual booking. What is your best guess on the AI to use? I would say Anthropic on that. What metrics fall under the other category? On that other category, the most common thing named was repetition. People think that the AI is repeating itself too much, re-asking questions that they feel like it should have gotten the answer to. Second, being too pushy. That's going to look like, someone may be saying, oh yeah, I'm not going to be selling my house until next year because my grandma died. And the AI responding with, okay, I'll keep in mind next year. Instead of, oh, I'm so sorry about your grandma. How are you doing? Too pushy toward what it's supposed to be working on and not as empathetic as it should be. GPT 5.2 also has 5.2 chat instant. Any plans on trying that variant? I'm sure the team has tried that. Alex, yeah. We try things pretty much immediately when they come out, and then we continue to try over time. Martin said, what made you switch to OpenAI for true-false AI custom scenario and go accomplish evaluations? I feel like Anthropic was way more accurate. We stick to OpenAI. I'd still pick 4.1 over 5.2. Team found in testing. So we have deployment tests when we go to deploy new changes. We have mock conversations that happen before code can hit production for you guys. And through running through those tests, those are just the ones we found to be most accurate. So maybe you found something to be more accurate, but that's probably for your specific edge case. Are you looking to continue to monitor in future months to see if there are trends over time, Tom? Yeah, definitely. This is something that we will have to do on a recurring basis. So if you're using CloseBot, use those thumbs up and thumbs down buttons. Is there a safety feature that recognizes an unsavory competitor in our industry using AI to run up our bill in endless conversation? JB, there is a low voted feature request for limiting the number of messages a job flow is able to respond. I encourage you to go vote on that feature request. Ron, is there a way that CloseBot can create a task if necessary? For example, a chat requires me to give a client a t-shirt next time I see them. Can it send me a to-do item either via email or task created in high level? No, not right now. I will say the secret stuff we're working on will handle that. Does the enterprise plan have a lower price per response? All the responses and usage are lumped into what your enterprise plan cost would be. It seems like prompting is a big factor when it comes to the performance of the LLM/model. How do you ensure prompting is not the constraint to a specific model's performance when testing which is best? So for us, we're able to look at the millions of messages and large scale across the board feedback. And that kind of wipes out that variable of the prompting. When you're looking at many messages across many different users, that variable tends to wash out. In your own testing, that's a little different. If you wanted to run your own testing, you would want to use the same prompting, as basic as possible, and use different providers over a certain period of time to test which works best for you. And then once you pick which works best for you, which foundation you like the best, then you could go toward that. Can CloseBot automatically update custom fields based on the conversation? Yes. Yep. We've been able to do that for about 3 years. Okay. Guys, huge. This is the type of stuff I love working on. I'll be doing more of this stuff. The best way to keep up to date with what we're working on is to get a free CloseBot account if you don't have one already. That way you get on our email list. We'll let you know about all these resources. Another thing worth mentioning, we just got our community set up. Within your CloseBot app, head over to Hub and Community. And this is the new area where we will be posting everything. We have our Ask the Community section. We have some chat groups. And this is where we're going to be holding our office hours and other events. So this is the best way to stay updated. And we are just white labeling an app called Circle. We have highly customized it, of course, but if you want to have this available on mobile, you can scroll down to here, iOS or Android download, and then we're right there on mobile for you too. Okay, before we go, we do have our webinar coming up on AI voice with CloseBot. That is in our resources section. So if you're curious about that, I'd love to see you there. We're going to have a special guest there. I want to see you on that webinar. I know a lot of people in here are using voice, and it'd be nice to know how that works exactly with CloseBot here going forward. Okay. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you on the next one.